Welcome to today's webinar. This is part of Digital Building Week. I'm Chloe McCulloch. I'm Editorial Director at Building Magazine. And this webinar looks at untangling the digital path to achieve the golden thread in construction. With me today, I have Kevin McCarran, who is Divisional Director of Fire Safety at Hydrock. We have Melanie Robinson, Associate at Ryder Architecture, and Brent Rees, Head of Digital Engineering at Ridge and Partners. So I just want to give a little bit of the context here. So today's discussion is happening at the same time. In the background, the government has made a recent clarification that the golden thread information does not have to be stored on one system. So it's quite an interesting question that then throws up about what impact does this have on the building safety information and how should it be organized. So that will be probably a topic that the speakers will talk about. Their presentations aren't specifically on that point, but I think it might be an interesting point to discuss later. And there is an opportunity for you as the audience to post your questions to the panel. So please do that as and when you think of a question, and we will come to that at the Q&A. So this panel is really talking about their work handling building safety information to ensure that there's transparency and accountability across projects. So just a reminder, these webinars are recorded, so you can get them on demand and you can recommend them to your colleagues if they're not able to attend the session at this time. I think that is probably enough for me. I'm going to hand over to Kevin first, who is going to kind of set the scene for us, outlining some of the bigger, broader issues with his presentation. So I am going to turn my webcam off, and we will, and Melanie will as well, and then over to you, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Chloe. That was a very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, to the webinar. Chloe obviously gave you the spoiler alert that I am a humble building safety professional, so we won't be getting into much depth about open source or proprietary software, low code, no code options, or I won't even be talking about much detail about BIM. I'll leave that to experts Brent and Melanie, who are following me, and they're much more knowledgeable in that subject matter. Instead, I'll be setting the scene for the discussion this afternoon. Now that we're approaching the business end of the Building Safety Act and its implementation, it might be sort of prudent to remind ourselves how we got here and why we feel digitation is required. The presentation comes from the perspective that not everybody is tuning in. Will have its own innovation department, its capability to develop complex software. So the presentation is very high level, but it will provide a picture of what accountability in the digital realm will look like. I'm also going to give some opinion on the government's recent announcement that the digital golden thread information can be delivered in more than one platform. On the face of it, it might be seen as a bit of a U-turn, but it may also just be a realistic appraisal of where we are in terms of digitization within the industry that we work. So I'll now just presentation on. Okay, so a new culture of digital accountability. So the topics today is why we need digital accountability, and quite simply one slide, which probably won't need any introduction, but hopefully that says it all. I'll provide an overview of the Building Safety Act, just to remind ourselves what it's about, why the digital golden thread is required, and how we're going to go about capturing it. I'll also take you through the new approvals process for higher risk buildings. And then have a few slides on digital accountability. Accountability, competency, responsibility are words that we're going to be hearing a lot of over the next year, 2 years. And the digital accountability is obviously central to that. I wanted a few slides just to see what standardisation might look like at some time in the future, and then I'll have a few closing remarks just to sort of rest everybody and just encourage everybody to show a bit of leadership in implementing all aspects of the Building Safety Act. So why do we need digital accountability? Hopefully this slide needs no introduction now. This is the Grenfell web of blame. And this was introduced at the Grenfell inquiry by the legal representatives of family of the bereaved. It's not meant to embarrass or offend, but if true, the diagram paints a picture of disorganisation, a lack of leadership, and just as important, accountability. In fact, it's taken well over 2 years to try and understand who was accountable or is accountable in terms of the Grenfell tragedy. However, the subsequent review by Dame Judith Hackett suggested that our industry was in need of significant change in its approach to building safety and how we construct buildings. It's obviously led to a major overhaul of our regulations, with the Fire Safety Act receiving royal assent in 2021, and then the Building Safety Act in April 2022, and that's what we're going to talk about next. The Building Safety Act it is a massive culture change. In fact, it's the biggest change in regulation in a generation, roughly 45 years. It wants to create a paradigm shift in our industry approach and culture. And whether it's going to be culture change or culture shock depends on how well we as an industry have been preparing for its implementation. And the focus is in delivering quality and safety. And we're now being asked to regard buildings as systems. And obviously systems need regular maintenance and care if they're going to work efficiently. And there's those three words again: accountability, competency, and responsibility. There's now a need for a risk-based, proportionate regulatory framework, and it's got to be outcomes-based. There's now a need, and I'll touch this later on, there's now a need for us in the construction industry, whether or not we're a principal client, principal designer, principal contractor, or building manager, we're going to need to prove that we know what we're doing and we know what we're what we have done. And we're now going to have to build and construct buildings, especially residential buildings, with empathy and a genuine concern for the residents that are living in those. We've got to build a reputation. The reputation was at an all-time low, obviously following Grenfell. And it's up to us all who are working in our industry to change that. So I just want to touch on the golden thread. Pretty simple slide. The golden thread is effectively takes us through design right up to disposal. I'm going to touch on it later in the presentation, but really some people think that the golden thread should start at ground investigation and carry all the way through until the building's disposed. And I'm a big believer in that. For instance, ground investigation, if the ground that we're building on isn't right, then we're going to see structural failure. So there's an argument that we should take the golden thread right back to that point. Now, I'm just going to take you through the new approval process and then just discuss where the DGT comes in. So the general format for a building is planned, it's designed, it's constructed, and then it's occupied. But the new Building Safety Act now brings in 3 gateways. It brings in a planning gateway. It brings in Gateway 2, which is the changeover from design into construction. And then Gateway 3, you'll be permitted to occupy the building. And overseeing all that is a building safety regulator. Now, when planning, a fire statement, for instance, will be required to sign off by a chartered engineer if you want to see your way through planning. And Gateway 2 is a hard stop, so you need permission from the building safety regulator to commence construction. That's a massive change. There's no longer building at risk. So it is a hard stop. It's been mooted to take 12 weeks. It's a 12-week process. And then you'll have to be permitted to move on to the construction phase. Any significant change during the construction phase, and these are significant change is listed in the new secondary legislation, which was brought out a couple of months ago. That tells you what it is, but that will be a hard stop. So construction stops until the change is resolved and accepted. And then once again, Gateway 3, the building safety regulator requires to be satisfied that the building that you were given permission to build is that which is actually being built. And then finally, if the building safety regulator is satisfied that the building meets all the required structural and fire safety requirements, then a certificate will be issued, allowing you to occupy the building. Now, within that, there'll be duty holders. The principal client will be a duty holder early in the process. There'll be a principal designer, there'll be a principal contractor, and a principal accountable person. But all along the whole process, there will be accountable persons. And we'll talk about what that accountability means later in the presentation. But throughout that process, as we said, from ground investigation, from design, all the way through to occupation, you will have to maintain a digital golden thread of building information, relevant building information. I would suggest that is related to structural and fire safety. So anything that needs inspected, maintained, reviewed, replaced, that will all have to go into your digital golden thread. But when we talk about digital accountability, we may want to consider further information to be included in the DGT. Now, I'm just listing that up as a few documents. So there's 10 main documents that will be required at Gateway 2 and Gateway 3 for building safety regulator approval. Now, not all these documents consist of the golden thread. The golden thread will be taken from quite a lot of these files or documents. But these are the documents which the building safety regulator needs to see for approval. So the digital golden thread philosophy, initially, we want to use digital tools and systems. We work in a modern construction industry, and for us not to digitise now is a bit archaic in my opinion. We want to support duty holders and accountable persons throughout the life cycle of any building during gateway processes, and we need to record the original design intent, and we need to ensure subsequent changes to buildings are captured and preserved. We need to incorporate all the information needed to understand the building, how it should be managed, and it's what should be inspected, what should be replaced, what should be maintained. And the information needs to be easily available to the right person at the right time. And that includes in the occupied stage. of a residential building, there'll be residence panels, and they will need access to this type of information as well. So we want to put place in a new higher standard of information keeping, which will support the building safety regulator and give them the confidence that buildings are being managed correctly and safely. So I just wanted to bring everyone back and remind them of the 10 tenets, digital golden thread tenets. So the digital golden thread should be accurate and trusted, make residents feel more secure in their homes, promote cultural change. But the big one here is be a single source of truth. And the government have just released information that, or guidance that the digital golden thread can be maintained on different platforms, and that fills me with unease. Unless later, and I'll talk about a single source of record for the building. Unless we have a single source of record, I think we lose many of the tenets that we were trying to promote. It doesn't promote accountability. It's less understandable and consistent. It won't be simple to access the information by the right person at the right time. Will it have longevity, durability, and shareability of data? Because that's really important. Because as I'm going to talk about in one of the slides coming, the digital golden thread is all about trackback. It's all about traceability. And will it be relevant and proportionate? Well, the fact that we're able to store the digital golden thread in several systems is proportionate, depending on where we are as businesses, organisations, in terms of our digitisation. So there's certainly, at the very least, a dilution of many of the original tenets. So digital accountability. So accountability, there will always be a principal accountable person. So that's the person that's responsible for anything that occurs, any harm to a building occupant. They will be responsible for that, and they'll be responsible for the design, construction of a building. They'll be responsible for everyone who has worked in design, who's worked in construction, and then if they take on the building management, they'll be responsible for all the residents within that building. And there's duty holders all the way through the process. And a simple note here is building control authorities are not duty holders. In the old days or previous regimes, regulatory regimes, the building safety, the building control officer or approved inspector would effectively sign a building off. And that's one person signing a building and saying that that building's safe. That's not the case anymore. The principal accountable person is responsible for the safety in that building. And under the new safety case regulations, the principal accountable person who is responsible for occupation will have to keep arguing that that building's safe. A traceability digital golden thread. We're now in a region where we're now in a mode where Defective Premises Act has changed. So before June, to any claims before June 2022, you'll be liable for 30 years before that date. And any buildings constructed after that date, it's 15 years. So anything that goes wrong within any building, any system that doesn't work, then the golden thread provides the ability to trace back to who made the decision, who did the installation, and all the sort of decision-making process involved around installing that system within the building. And the digital golden thread allows the principal accountable person duty holders to hold other people to account. And that's why supply chain management is really important. Communication, change management is key. If any changes are made to the design or any part of construction or in occupation, everyone needs to know about it, including the residents of the building in occupation. So all information needs to be up to date, and certainly in the construction phase, there needs to be a hell of a lot of collaboration between all parties. I'll remind you of the web of blame slide. And all this needs to be digital logged. So any changes to any software system needs to be logged so it can be traced back. So that's effectively what we mean by digital accountability. And you'll be
Kevin,
asked.
I'm just going to quickly, I know that you've got a lot of slides to get through. I'm just aware of the time. So
Okay.
it was just a prompt to speed through some of your other slides, if that's okay.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks, Chloe. I'll just finish off with this slide and then I'll move on to the end. So digital golden thread is retrospective, starts with ground truth, it is traceability, but you need to prove you're making the correct decisions. You need to prove your supply chain is competent. You need to prove that you've designed correctly, and you need to prove that you've built correctly and that you're managing risks correctly all the way through that process. I'll just move on to the final slide. I'll make some closing remarks. Government has recognised that organisations within the UK construction industry are in different places in terms of resource and development. Therefore, there's not going to be any digital standardisation for the moment. But systematically, there has to be an industry aspiration to embrace new culture of accountability. And digitisation will help industry collate the golden thread of the evidence, and that will help raise standards. I'll remind you about, BIM wasn't mandated, and BIM will offer many of the solutions, and I'm pretty sure Brent and Melanie will speak about that this shortly after me. And whilst there's a focus in higher risk buildings at the minute, we should be, as an industry, creating muscle memory. And obviously, we should be applying all these standards and trying to develop a higher standard for all buildings, not just residential buildings. And on that note, Chloe, I'll hand back to you if that's okay.
Thank you so much. I'm really sorry to have interrupted you in mid-flow, because it's all really interesting stuff. But I think maybe some of the points that you had in those slides we can bring into our general conversation at the end. So thank you very much, Kevin. I'm going to invite Melanie to turn her camera off. Kevin will turn his, Melanie to turn hers on, and Kevin to turn his off. And then hopefully Melanie can share her screen as well. Thank you. Oh, Melanie, I don't think we can hear you.
Brilliant. No, that should be it now. Perfect. Brilliant. Okay, no, hi everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this event. I thought Kevin's slides were an excellent I guess segue into what I'm going to be speaking about, which is really about digital information management, more generally than just thinking about BIM. But just by way of introduction, my name is Melanie Robinson. I'm an associate digital consultant with Ryder Architecture and BIM Academy. I also sit on the Building Safety Alliance Special Interest Group, looking at what the golden thread means, and a regional lead for women in BIM. But just kind of reiterating a few things that Kevin touched on in the first instance is, what is the golden thread? Well, the golden thread, to put it simply, is the information that allows you to understand a building and the steps needed to keep both the building and people safe now and in the future. The key here is that the golden thread must be digital, or rather the word the regulations use is electronic. And that's really quite critical, because we need to move away from ultimately holding our information in hard copy, but also it depends on how we want to hold our information digitally as well, and how to maintain it more to the point. Just to go through a bit of the jargon, the terminology that has been bandied about recently. So the golden thread, its genesis resides in the design and construction of buildings. When we hand over our buildings, our high risk buildings, that is, we have an obligation to maintain a safety case, or the owner operators have, or the accountable person has an obligation. And the safety case really is a structured argument as to how you are keeping your building safe from risk of fire and structural collapse. And then every 5 years or so, the building safety regulator will call upon your safety case for review by way of a safety case report, which really should be a snapshot of what the safety case is, how you're keeping it up to date, and signposting to where you are maintaining this information, and maintaining elements such as your residents engagement strategy and your mandatory occurrence reporting. And ultimately, the golden thread, as I say, its genesis resides within the early stages of any project. And Kevin touched on this in his presentation by looking at what we've typically come to know as the single source of truth, but in reality is works by way of what we call a distributed common data environment, that is looking at how good information management principles can be used to preserve the ethos of a single source of truth, even when multiple systems are in use. So making sure that we are calling upon the most relevant information at the point when we need it the most. I referred to the safety case as a structured argument, and that's precisely what it is, because well, really, to draw on another word that Kevin used, proportionate, one of the 10 principles of the golden thread, there's no point collecting and maintaining every single piece of information about your building. It wouldn't serve your interest, and it wouldn't it wouldn't do you many favors in terms of finances either. It's really about doing the most you can within the uh, within your capabilities, essentially, based on the risks inherent within the building and how compliant you need to be as well. One thing we need to think about, and this is where it touches on BIM in particular, but other design processes as well, is that closing that gap between as designed and as built. As an industry, we've relied quite heavily on last construction issue, whereas what we need to think about now is actually, is what we've built a representation of what we've designed, and vice versa. And we've seen some pretty drastic changes between as designed and as built, and we can't function like that as an industry anymore. And we have to be able to rely on our information and on our digital information to be representative of what's behind our walls. This is just a case study from a hospital in Canada, but the principles are very much the same, in that what was designed wasn't what was as built, and ultimately can lead to confusion, particularly when we're dealing with building safety. And something I've been talking a lot about recently is the need to maintain information, because it's no longer just about as designed and as built, it's also about as built and as maintained. And that's because you can absolutely maintain your building, and we all maintain our buildings, but what we tend to find is the information doesn't follow suit. Information doesn't have that same rigor in its maintenance regime as our physical building. And one way to think about it is, past handover, we change our physical building all the time. And we can think of them as little mini projects. And those projects will change in size and scale depending on the complexity of the project at hand. And so a building adaptation will be a larger project than, let's say, you're servicing or your fire extinguisher. But the point is that you're building information, more information into your information model all the time. And if we plot that on a graph, then the quantity of as maintained information naturally will grow. Whereas if we kept our digital information as built, then there would be a massive discrepancy between what our physical reality is telling us and what our digital information is telling us. And the reason this is important is because at the point of handover, as-built information is the highest value it will ever be. Further and further we get into operation, the more our digital information starts to become divorced from our physical building, meaning it's less reliable and we can't trust what it's saying. Whereas if we keep that information in an as maintained state, then it will inherently be reliable, of high value to the consumer of that information throughout operation. So looking at digital information management, let's start with the elephant in the room. BIM fatigue is real, and I see that a lot in my job. We had a mandate for BIM. It wasn't exactly realized in reality across the entire industry, and we started to see BIM as a bit of a dirty word. So let's shift how we think about it. Well, there's a massive rhetoric at the moment in our industry to shift from what we've known as building information modeling to better information management. And that rings true in particular in the case of the Building Safety Act, where we're thinking about information more generally. And that's critical here because we, as much as we love a BIM environment, I'm speaking quite selfishly here, we need to think about information in its entirety, encompassing documents, encompassing O&M manuals, encompassing that information that might not necessarily live within the 3D environment or be interacted with from within a 3D environment. But if we shift how we think about BIM and think about it more as a database with a pretty front end, the 3D front end, then what we would need to think about is, well, the spatial and asset hierarchies are still very important. The consistent naming conventions are still very important. And more to the point, even if the client didn't really want to touch the 3D environment and past handover, which a lot don't, if they don't have the capacity to deal with the 3D environment, they would absolutely still want their asset data to be kept up to date without a single doubt. So when we think of it like that, it's not really there's a bit of a divorce in reality, because the Farmer Review in 2016 highlighted that in particular in the residential sector, BIM just didn't proliferate. It just wasn't there to a large extent. And now all of a sudden we're being told to deliver this information digitally, to maintain this information digitally, and to do it in a structured way. Well, maybe BIM is the answer. But I think, just going back, we need to think about information agnostically. That's simply the case. We need to break it down to plain language. What information does everyone within the owner operator team need to have to do their day job? And it can be for various reasons. It can be knowing space names to be able to book out spaces, to plan who residents within flats. It could be for asset maintenance and knowing what your assets are tagged and knowing what model numbers they are. It could be down to even statutory regulation and being able to understand how much energy your building is consuming. So we all need information management. So we might not necessarily need BIM, but we all need information management. So I'm just going to fly through this last bit because I'm conscious that Brent is up behind me and may well expand on some of what I've said. But to put it frankly, we need to move away from this being a reality. We need to move away from the risk of fires, floods, even a hungry mouse damaging our information. We need to also think about PDFs not too different as well. And also, I'm not being funny, but this is no different to storing everything in a large paper stack. If someone asked you to go and find the instruction manual for your kettle in this folder structure, you would really struggle. And that's because there's no structure in place. There's no rigorous structure in place. And that's my point about information maintenance, is that it might be handed over to you in a very neat BIM model, a very neat COBie schema, a very neat whatever structure it is. But as soon as you start maintaining that or not maintaining that information and just throw in any old document in there, name with whatever name, it gets really difficult to manage very, very quickly. And what we need to do within this digital world to make sure that doesn't happen is whenever we've got a new project is to bookend the entire process with a digital digital bookends essentially, where you have your information requirements at the start, which the client says, look, this is what information I will need at the end, and this is how I need that information to be provided to me. And then at the other end, it's all about managing that information in an asset management model. It's no different to existing buildings either. The only difference is how information is generated, collected, managed throughout the generation and production process. But otherwise, we would still start off with setting out our information requirements, and we would still need to manage that information after it's been handed over. Just skipping past this, what we need to realize is, or one thing we can realize rather than me telling you what to do, is there are a lot of tools out there to help us in this information management journey. One of which is the ISO 19650 standards, which is ultimately what is driving our understanding of BIM in the UK and across the world. I won't bore you with what each one of those are, but what I will say is the Building Safety Alliance is utilising these standards to drive forward a consistent industry approach. So we've been looking at identifying the minimum viable product for accountable persons and how they can manage their information digitally using the principles set out by ISO 19650. Some of the principles I'll just quickly touch on is using common data environments, which has already been touched on a little bit in the past, where we want to move away from sharing information in linear fashions, i.e. using emails, using pigeon posts, whatever. We need to start using document management systems that are designed for that purpose. A SharePoint can absolutely function as a common data environment if it is set up correctly, if we are recording version histories, if we are capturing permissions and who can access that information or not. The other side to it is naming information is one of the less glamorous parts of my job, telling people how to name information, but it is so critical for this all to work. If you think back to that slide with the digital information that is named horrendously, you can see why it is important. And the idea is that it makes it searchable and auditable ultimately. As well as the metadata like revision status to understand how we can use that information and to what extent we can rely on it as well. And this is going to help information managers such as myself. And this is something we've been really keen on pushing recently, is that auditing and quality assurance of common data environments. Are people naming files correctly? Again, it doesn't sound very glamorous, but it is key to unlocking the value of information. And the real value of information also comes in monetary terms as well. So the quicker we can access more reliable information, the more we can achieve savings in operation. And I'll finish on this, but really this is why I'm seeing the Building Safety Act as a bit of a Trojan horse, maybe not necessarily for BIM as in building information modelling, but certainly for better information management, particularly digital information management. And that's from just better insights into our buildings, better definition of information requirements at the start, and ultimately better maintenance of information after the building has been handed over. So I've just finished on that and pass over to Brent. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Melanie. That was brilliant and really good to end on a positive note in that presentation. So I'm going to invite Brent to turn on his webcam if he can.
Yeah,
that's fantastic. Thank you. And if you can share your screen, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my screen shortly. Hopefully that's sharing now. Thank you very much for inviting me today, and thank you to Kevin and Melanie for kicking off as well. I'm going to keep it brief because I'm mindful of time. Struggling to talk. There we go. Sorry. So my name's Brent Rees. I'm partner and head of discipline within Region Partners. So I look after digital engineering, so BIM consultancy services, and an aspect of design management within that as well. And we deliver kind of certified and award-winning services in the BIM and design management space, principally kind of information management and BIM coordination, amongst a series of others. I wanted to start with a timeline and just touch on the number of years that have passed since the Grenfell disaster, and the key kind of bits of information that have come out that point at Golden Thread are the Hackett report, for one, which can be accessed through that link there, and the Building Regulations Advisory Committee Golden Thread report as well, which was released a few years later, which kind of reinforces the concepts that came out of the Hackett report. And the Hackett report kind of outlined reform across multiple industries and pointed at the creation of a digital record and the use of BIM-enabled data sets. And the BRAC Golden Thread report kind of reinforced that and specifically said that the UK BIM framework, which has been developed by industry over several years, could also support implementation of the Golden Thread. And I think the key takeaway amongst that is, that those principles can support that. I think it does paint an image of how BIM can be used across those projects, but it's more about how those principles are used flexibly, I think. The BIM mandate was used to varying degrees of success, as Melanie and Kevin pointed at, and I think the use of the Golden Thread and the Building Safety Act was more like if the level 2 mandate was a carrot to incentivize industry to work more efficiently, then the Golden Thread and the Building Safety Act were more like a stick to try and drive kind of better safety through our projects, but also our buildings. And I guess another point to note, that post the release of the BRAC Golden Thread report was BS 8644, which pointed at extensions to COBE, which is one of the main deliverables from the BIM mandate. And again, whether or not that's appropriate is a case of, what does the organisation or the accountable party need in order to manage that. But I think when I think about BIM and how that's used on projects, there are three facets to it. The three key assets in my mind are models, kind of geometric 3D models, data, so we commonly refer to COBE data within the industry, and 8644 now points at FIRE being the extended kind of parameters of that. And then, as Melanie's kind of touched on time and time again, the common data environment. And if they're kind of three kind of key core aspects of BIM as a process, how could they be used to maintain a golden thread of information? And I think what that did initially, certainly when the Hackett report was released, was it kind of introduced some thoughts around models and data and how they're used and how we interact with buildings. But the reality is that there's an enormous amount of building stock that already exists that also still needs to be managed in the same way. And so applying those BIM principles through a kind of new project lens doesn't necessarily work. So it's as much about how an organization, an accountable party or person structures the information that they keep about existing assets as it is about how we deliver information for new ones. I think that's all I'm going to touch on that one. Kevin touched on the kind of 10 points I think that were taken from the Golden Thread report. The HSE, who are kind of who basically forming the building safety regulator, have a web page accessible through that QR code, which summarizes into 6 points, which tie up with what Kevin shared earlier. But it says that building information must be kept digitally, which kind of makes sense. And I think to compare and contrast, in a BIM process, information could be kept in a model, but keeping it digitally could also mean keeping on a SharePoint system, as Melanie's also alluded to. Kept securely is another point, so making sure that access rights are controlled so that different parties can see and access what they need. A single source of truth is also mentioned within that, and I think, as Chloe outlined at the start, I think there's an element of rowing back on that, but it depends how you view that guidance. Information, I suppose, could be kept on different platforms, provided there are integrations to join those pieces of information up. and make sure that it's always pointing at the latest version of something. Therefore, you're still accessing a single something. Available for the right people and available at the right time. Again, that's about kind of permissions and who can access it and when they access it. And if you think about BIM in terms of models and data contained within models, maybe that's not appropriate. Maybe some organizations, entities don't have the right skills or tools to be able to access that information, which I guess leads on to the final point about it being usefully accessible. So information contained within models might not be as useful as perhaps storing it in a structured spreadsheet or a structured database, or structuring unstructured information like PDFs in a structured way so that it can be accessed. So some key considerations. So I like to kind of break these things down into three parts. So if you think about the client or the accountable person's organization, we need to think about their systems, their skill sets, and their strategy. So performing a gap analysis of current technology and processes that they have in place, and to see if any silos between those systems can be broken down by linking them through integrations or processes, perhaps, to make sure that information is being used appropriately. Assigning responsibility within that organization to make sure that some people are taking ownership for maintaining and updating information, again, like Melanie alluded to in her presentation. And if those people aren't in place, assigning responsibility, providing training, or getting kind of the skills in to do it. And then thinking longer term about what the strategy might be. If an organization is going to achieve the very minimum for aligning with the Golden Thread principles now, what's their roadmap for embracing new technology, for getting new skill sets on board, and for extending their capability? And it might be that something like SharePoint could be used and configured now to meet some of those things. And it might mean that in 5 years' time, they have a plan to adopt a more mature accommodation environment platform. So I've sort of already touched on the kind of new and existing buildings kind of dilemma, in that it seems quite clear how BIM could be applied to a new building or project, but less clear how that applies to existing buildings. And where we are presently, there are hundreds and thousands of people that are affected by the existing buildings that they are living in, versus the kind of handful of buildings that are going to be delivered in a slightly different way as a result of this regulation over the next few years. So yes, BIM principles can be applied for that. We can deliver models, we can deliver data for new buildings. How do we do that for existing buildings? Does it mean we have to have a 3D model? Not necessarily, but if a visual representation of that is useful, then it could be scanned, but we need to recognize that it's only ever going to represent the things you can see on the surface, so we won't get perhaps as much information about the things that lay behind that. And then the final point, which kind of resonates with the point that Melanie was making, is that models and information management, or BIM and information management, can often be two different things. And I think these accountable parties and organizations need to think really about if a model is actually what they need, and are they going to maintain that, or do they not just need a more sophisticated structure for storing all the bits of information they need about their building. And so this is my final slide, just to point at something we've done for an organization that manages several high-rise blocks, is that my team collaborated with a number of others, our property consultants and our fire consultants within Ridge, and they'd already developed a kind of template building safety case to list all the pieces of information that an organization might need to manage their building safely. And we went on a journey to try and work out how we might be able to configure that specifically for this client. Again, I'm not saying this is the kind of silver bullet solution to meet the golden thread. This is a solution, and it really needs that consultation with the parties to work out what they need. But we use a low-code cloud-based database solution to make a structure to contain those various pieces of information per building. And then we used a reporting tool over the top of that to flag when time-bound pieces of information might have been coming up to being overdue and out of date. And then we put a browser user interface over the top, and we were able to configure kind of access permissions for different groups of people that need to access it and see the bits they required. And that's what we're sort of branding a kind of digital building safety case, really. But I guess my final message on that is that this isn't the final solution. There are many ways to set about achieving the kind of principles of the golden thread. And you kind of need to kind of look around at the regulations, what the accountable person needs, what systems they have in place, and how you're able to apply that flexibly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brent. I'm going to put my camera back on, and then if everyone else can come back on screen, and then we can just have our final 10 minutes. So thank you so much for those detailed presentations. There's a lot of information to get across, so I really appreciate the slides that you put together, and I know our audience will. I think one issue that was underlying all of them, it's something I flagged at the start, was around this point that there has been a slight change or possible clarification from the government in terms of not needing one system. And I think you all touched on it, but I thought I'd just use this forum where we can sort of speak to each other to just exchange ideas around how do you think that's going to work in practice? Where, what have you been hearing from practitioners about how they intend to approach that now? I thought maybe Melanie, start with you, and then bring in Kevin and Brent.
Sure. I mean, the concept that I touched on, a distributed common data environment, is not new per se, in the sense that we have always, at least within the BIM world, we've always dealt with people hosting their own environments for their own information. Like the contractor would typically host their own platform. If the client has their own, they'd host theirs, and then the information would be transferred at appropriate points across to the client. But what's really important there is are the information management principles that underpins that. So making sure that you know where the most recent information is, knowing that is the most recent file, knowing the history of that information as well, so being able to record how that information is consumed and exchanged between the different systems. It's definitely not the ideal utopia where we want to move to, where everything's in one system. And in particular for documents, I would highly recommend we strive to achieve as fewer systems as possible to host that information. But at the same time, I recognize that there isn't such a great tool out there. And if there is, it's going to cost a lot of money to invest in, to build the capability for. But I will let someone else answer now if anyone else has got any input on that.
Yeah, Kevin, I don't know if you want to chip in there.
I take Melanie's point. The most crucial thing from a building safety point of view in terms of going through, the big concern I've got, and I wanted to touch on it, was interoperability. And it's taking information through from design into construction phase, and then from construction phase into building occupation. And it's having the digital golden thread conform and have a generic, consistent line. I've worked in many buildings just to get down to the pragmatic part, where I'm looking at as-built drawings, we're reviewing buildings, and it doesn't look anything like that. Now, we could put forward many reasons for that, but one of the reasons could be that people just aren't looking at the most up-to-date version of it. And the more complex the building is, the more documentation, the more documents and information has to be reviewed. So it's, for me, the single source of truth gives a bit of comfort that you're always looking at the most up-to-date version of a document. For instance, a fire safety strategy, a structural strategy for a building.
Brent, do you want to come in on that point before I move on to one more question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with the points both Melanie and Kevin have made there, in that I think a single source of truth for every document is absolutely essential. I think that could still be achieved. I personally think that could still be achieved across more than one system, provided it's absolutely clear that that system is used for this and that system is used for that. However, it would be better if there were some stretch targets for the next 5-10 years to try and encourage industry to develop and move into a single environment. And I think, you know, whether that's in the form of a mandate or whether that's in the form of some incentives, I think that might be a better way to approach it.
No, that's an interesting idea, actually, to kind of think, okay, it's not maybe possible right now, and we have to be pragmatic about cost, as you said, Melanie, but actually think about, well, what is the ideal, and can we not aim for that in some way as an industry, and get some thought processes going on that. Okay, I'm going to move to another question. This, I think, is a bit more targeted at you, Kevin, but it's around... it's a very long question, but it's basically around there being this accountability gap or competency gap between maybe the designer and then the fire engineer. So I think that this is coming from an architectural perspective, saying that they've got insurance for the design for designers, but then they have to bring in a fire engineer to actually specify the construction products to make sure that they're covered. And they're finding that most fire engineers aren't covered for the level of designing involvement. So they've kind of got this bit where the fire engineers got to do some design work, and the design, you know, and are you seeing that as well?
Yes. It's very much it's very much insurance led, and I do take the point, and it is consistent with other conversations that we have with most of our architect clients. The thing about the new regime is the fire engineer will be part of a supply chain. So you have to rely not only on the fire engineer, all the other sort of traditional disciplines will all be part of a supply chain, with the principal designer being responsible for their competency, and they will be responsible for making sure that fire engineers and all the other engineers are working within their level of competency. So that's why I think it's important, and that's why that should form part of the digital golden thread, because the people who are designing the building, engineers, and the people who are constructing buildings, that advisement's key. So the advisement I give to my clients is absolutely crucial for the future safety of the building in occupation. I know that's not quite answered the question, but it's a very complex. That is a very complex one.
The issue of insurance is there are still some unanswered questions. Basically, the insurance market probably catch up as to who's actually responsible for designing certain aspects of a building. Okay, we've also had a question just around where have people are asking, where is this information, the latest update from government around not needing a single source of truth for the golden thread? Was that in the latest sort of government guidance that was issued? It was just I think a request for more information on that. Where could people go to find out the latest government thinking? We'd be quite happy to leave it, but it's as a result of some consultations that happened last year, and the government have been slow to release the results of that. And I think that's taken the temperature of industry, and a big massive issue raised by those people undertaking the consultation and responding to government was that they're just not prepared. They haven't got the proper systems in place at the moment. So I can only imagine that the government took the view that it would be better at the moment to allow more than one systems and multiple systems, just be better organised, collaborate. But I do take Brent's point that we should move to some sort of standardisation sometime in the future, and there should be a programme and a timeline for us to get there. Yeah, Absolutely. Well, look, I note the time, and we've run out of it basically, but that's just because the presentations were so detailed and interesting. So thank you very much. We haven't been able to get through all of the questions, everyone, but thank you very much for posting them. I can see that people are very hungry for more information on this topic, so it was really good to cover it today. Just a reminder that this session will be available on demand. This is the last of our sessions of Digital Building Week, but we hope you found the week really useful, and all of our sessions are available. So it just remains for me to say a huge thank you to Kevin, Melanie and Brent for all of their work in putting together and putting forward those presentations, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chloe. Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you.